Hello and welcome, and thank you for joining us today for the first in a new series of informational briefings on carbon capture, removal, transport, storage, and utilization that we call Carbon Management 101. The objective of this event is to provide an opportunity for reporters who may now be covering some of these topics for the first time, or maybe not in a long time, to get a baseline understanding of what they all mean. This event is sponsored by the Great Plains Institute, which is www.betterenergy.org. My name is Ben Finzel. I am president of Renew PR, and I work with GPI on carbon management communications. I'll be the moderator for today's conversation. Before we begin, I should note that this conversation is being recorded and will be posted online to serve as a resource for others. Today's briefing includes an all-star panel of representatives from leading conservation, environmental, business, and labor groups, including National Wildlife Federation, Clean Air Task Force, Elysian, LanzaTech, LIUNA, and the Great Plains Institute. I'll introduce each of our speakers in a few minutes. But first, I just want to note that we have extensive Q&A opportunities after our Carbon Management 101 presentations on climate, carbon capture and removal, carbon transport, carbon storage and utilization, job creation and economic impacts, and bipartisan federal investments. You're welcome to start putting your questions in the Q&A box now, or you can wait until we begin the Q&A in a little bit, and you can ask them live. I'll call on you to ask them live if you prefer. So let's get started. I'm delighted to introduce Patrice Lahlum, a consultant to the Great Plains Institute, to start things off today. Patrice.
Thank you so much, Ben, and thanks to everyone for joining us today. As Ben said, I'm with the Great Plains Institute. GPI is a nonprofit based in Minneapolis and St. Paul, Minnesota, but we have a footprint across a wide swath of the country. If you want to go to the next slide, please. We've been working in the carbon management space for more than 2 decades, and our carbon management team has several efforts. On the left-hand side, you'll see the icon and the logo for the Carbon Capture Coalition, which is a national group that focuses on carbon management policies. The Industrial Innovation Initiative focuses on industrial decarbonization across a mid-continent footprint. And then the State Carbon Capture Work Group and the Regional Carbon Capture Deployment Initiative captures our state and regional carbon management work that has grown to be national in scope over the course of the last couple of years. And so with that backdrop of what we do at GPI, I am going to turn it back over to Ben Finzel to introduce my esteemed colleagues.
Thanks, Patrice. As you can see with our agenda today, the focus is our Carbon Management 101 presentations and then an open Q&A. So we look forward to hearing from Patrice as part of both of those. But first, we have a lot of insight to share today. We're going to do our best to cover a lot of ground in a relatively short period of time. But a word of warning, we're going to show you a lot of slides. There will be lots of charts and graphs and some small font. I apologize in advance. 2 things to keep in mind, though. 1, we'll be happy to go back to any of the slides during the Q&A. And 2, we will share the slides with all of you after the call. I'm going to introduce each person now in the order in which they'll speak so that I don't have to interrupt the flow of our conversation to introduce each one of them in turn later. So first, we'll hear from Simone Stewart, Industrial Policy Specialist for the National Wildlife Federation. She'll be followed by John Thompson, Technology and Markets Director for Clean Air Task Force. He will be followed by Keith Tracy, Chief Commercial Officer for Elysian. And he will be followed by Ben Grove, Staff Geoscientist at Clean Air Task Force, and Tom Dower, Vice President of Public Policy at LanzaTech. Next, we'll hear from Kevin Pranis, Marketing Manager for LIUNA, Minnesota and North Dakota. And finally, Patrice will come back and join us again before we move on to the Q&A. That's a whole lot. It's going to all be really good. So let's just get started and get right over to Simone to start the conversation.
All right, thank you so much for that opening, Ben. We can go to the next slide and go ahead and get started. So first, we wanted to set the stage for a lot of the information that we're going to be sharing today. And so as an industrial policy specialist, it's kind of my duty to set the stage with climate. And so the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or the IPCC, is a UN body that's made up of hundreds of scientists from dozens of countries. And for years, they've been conducting various analyses and models on climate to study basically the impacts that we're currently experiencing due to climate change. And so from those studies, we have learned that we have to limit global warming to 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius in order to therefore limit climate disaster and climate impacts. And so a big part of limiting that warming is reducing our emissions. It's essential to stop the warming, but we also have to tackle legacy emissions, or emissions that have been in our atmosphere cycling through our atmosphere since the Industrial Revolution. So that strategy is three-pronged. So we have to capture and manage emissions from industry and energy, offset the remaining emissions, and remove legacy emissions from the atmosphere. So if you go to the next slide. So as you can see by this, this graph, it's going to take a variety of solutions, but this graph shows that CCUS is going to play a major role in reducing emissions alongside electrification and the deployment of renewables. So it both reduces emissions in key sectors and combats emissions that are otherwise difficult to avoid, which we'll get into a little bit later in the presentation. But it's important to recognize that globally, heavy industries account for about 20% of emissions. So this is a direct way to combat them by using carbon capture, utilization, and storage. So if we go to the next slide. So what does this look like if we're to scale this up to the level that we need in order to meet our climate goals? So I'm going to give a basic overview, but we'll get into each one of these sections a little bit more in the presentation. But it first starts with carbon capture, utilization, and storage, where it is looking at CO2 captured at a point source. So maybe that's a specific industry. And then the other side of that is carbon removal strategies, where we're removing CO2, those legacy emissions that I brought up from the ambient air. Then we'll have to transport that CO2, so it'll be compressed and transported through a variety of methods. And then conversion is one of the outcomes that will be discussed a bit later. So that captured CO2 can serve as a feedstock for low carbon fuels or other products. And the other option is permanent storage, where the CO2 will be stored safely underground in rock formations where CO2 is already naturally occurring. So with that introduction, I'll pass it over to my colleague, John.
Thanks, Simone. Let's go to the next slide, please. Let's explore what drives carbon capture and storage projects in the United States. And the short answer is tax credits. 45Q tax credits reward developers for capturing CO2 and either utilizing it in products or isolating it deep underground and removing it from the atmosphere. Now, there's a range of costs for carbon capture and storage, as you can see in this little table in the slide. At the top of the table is ethanol. Fermentation releases a relatively pure stream of CO2, so the costs are pretty low. That's why you see that in the far column, $37 to $55 a ton. At the bottom of the table are things like power plants. Those capture costs are higher because the concentration of CO2 in the smokestack is lower, and therefore it costs more. So on the left-hand side of the screen, what you see are the value of 45Q tax credits over time. And it wasn't really until 2018, where you see that little starburst, when Congress raised the level of 45Q to say $50 a metric ton and $35 a metric ton, that ethanol, ammonia, gas processing, and things like some hydrogen applications really became economic. And there's a chance that they may raise them even higher in 2022 that would make it possible for things like refinery and steel and petrochemicals and other more expensive applications for this to work. So the key point of this slide is that carbon capture and storage works, but we haven't had enough projects in the past, largely because the incentive values weren't high enough. Next slide, please. What you see in this map are the different kinds of carbon capture projects that are possible in the upper Midwest. The light blue dots are ethanol, the kind of rose-colored things are refinery and cement, and at the bottom are pulp and paper. There's a lot of opportunities here, and that 45Q tax credits can make those happen. Next slide, please. But the key thing for, if we go to the next slide, somewhere, let's see, I'll just wait for you to catch up to me here. The key thing on, there we go, is that there's really, at current levels, there's a lot of examples of near and medium term capture opportunities. And these are going to focus primarily on ammonia, cement, ethanol refineries, and gas processing. We have the opportunity in the near term to capture about 40 million metric tons of CO2 per year. That's a lot. You know, just to put that in some perspective, all of the solar and wind in Iowa, for example, in our biggest state of solar and wind, captures about 14 million metric tons a year. So over these 5 states, we can really do a lot that will really help. Next slide, please. And really the key thing is carbon capture works. You know, for 50 years, we've been developing carbon capture in industrial applications. And we have 12 of them that are actually doing the whole thing, most in the entire country. And with the higher levels of 45Q tax credits, we have 90 projects that have been announced really in the last year. And when I say this technology is demonstrated, we've been doing this on gas processing. On the next slide, please. We've been doing it in gas processing since 1972. We've been doing it in fertilizer since 1982. We've been doing power plants since 2014. There's a lot of opportunities, and you can see on this map, which you can access in the link on the previous page, you know, the projects that are going on, that are being proposed right now. So the next slide, please. I want to conclude with just a couple of thoughts here. Carbon capture, carbon management is cost effective with other essential and low carbon technologies on a dollar per ton basis. And some industrial projects are developing right now because of favorable 45Q credits. And with a growth in these credits, we can see a lot more. So thanks, everybody. Let me pass on to my colleague, who's Keith Tracy. Will carry on from here.
Thanks, John. It's my pleasure to be with you today. I come from Oklahoma and grew up on a farm and ranch, so very familiar with some of the territories that you cover. I have experience in developing carbon capture projects and developing CO2 pipelines, including managing operations of those pipelines and compliance with federal regulations. I thought I might just touch on CO2 transport for a minute. You know, CO2 pipelines are really the most effective and efficient and safest way to transport large quantities of CO2. Excuse me. You know, the other options of trucks and rail cars, while it can be done, are much more involve much more inherent risks than the underground flow of the product without all that increased traffic. You know, the carbon capture industry and the CO2 pipeline industry in general has 50 years of a tremendous track record of designing, constructing, and operating pipelines. While CO2 pipelines may be kind of new to many people, they really are not new. We've been transporting over the last 50 years, we've transported over 500 million metric tons of CO2 with no significant accidents. You know, this is a product that's transported, and that product's really kind of different than maybe other products that have been transported by pipeline. You know, it's actually a product that we drink every day in our carbonated beverages. You know, pipeline operators, we really do have an obligation not only to our employees who work on the line, our neighbors in the communities where we work, and individual investors in our projects, to really take reasonable steps to make sure that these pipelines are operated safely and that they are monitored in a way that we understand exactly what's happening 24/7, 365. Any loss of product actually means loss of revenue. It means service interruptions. It means costly repairs, and that's really you know, a negative for everyone involved, and everyone strives to avoid those results. No one's perfect, and there's no such thing in this world that's perfect, but we strive for perfection every day, even with that great safety track record. And I think we continue to look for ways to improve how we design and construct and operate CO2 pipelines. And the new pipelines that will be built will be state of the art, and will build on that 50-year track record. Next slide, please. More CO2 pipelines are really going to need to be built to accomplish some of the goals that Simone and John talked about. Tens of thousands of miles of CO2 pipeline are going to be needed just in America alone. We really need to be smart about how these are and where these are located, and we need to be very thoughtful about where they should go. And one thing that I've been a big proponent of is making sure that if we're going to lay a line in a certain area, that it's kind of right sized for the future, and make sure that we put one in that's appropriately sized, even kind of planning for future volumes, and so that we don't have to lay a second or third pipeline in the same area. There's some assistance there mentioned at the bottom of this slide about the SCALE Act that was in the bipartisan infrastructure bill that really provides some support for that concept of making sure that these pipelines are smartly sized up front. So let me pause there, and Ben, let you take it away.
Thank you. So I'm Ben Grove. I have a background, I'm a geologist. I have a background in CCS projects from a technical side. So I'm going to bring our attention to the subsurface. And if you could go to the next slide, please, we'll get kicked off here. So to approach a subject as big, both spatially and just information loaded as geologic storage, I think it's a good idea for us to have a quick overview of how this works and hopefully align our minds with a sense of scale. And so storage project, we've covered capture and transport. Now what do we do with the CO2? The storage project really starts with geologists finding suitable location where the geology is carefully chosen and can actually take the CO2 and ensure that it's stored permanently. And so the two key, in its simplest form, the two key requirements for a storage project are: one, a reservoir rock, porous rock deep in the subsurface. This may be a saline aquifer that has highly salty water that's non-potable, perfect for taking CO2 that the CO2 is injected into. And then directly above that, it requires an impermeable rock layer, a cap rock, if you will, that prevents CO2 from migrating upward. And that essentially traps the CO2 in place. So if I bring your attention to the figure on the right here, let's talk about scale. When I say deep underground, many projects are often injecting CO2 over a mile in the subsurface. So what does that really mean? That means there is a solid rock column over a mile thick between the CO2 that's being injected and the surface of the earth. There's a significant space between underground sources of drinking water and the CO2 that's being injected. And superimposed on here to help aid in this visual is some of the highest buildings in the world. So you can really get a sense of scale. So please, next slide. So, I think the way we need to think about geologic storage is that we're essentially capturing carbon and returning it to where it came from. Most of the CO2 that would otherwise be emitted to the atmosphere originally came from the subsurface. We're simply putting it back where it came from. And so how much storage potential do we actually have? If we focus just on saline storage, which really represents the greatest storage potential in the US, there's an enormous storage capacity. To put a number on that, estimates of domestic saline storage capacity represent over 1,000 years worth of US annual emissions. So the potential is there. So how is it regulated? The EPA has an underground injection control program, which was designed to protect underground sources of drinking water. And this is a very robust regulatory framework that provides a backstop for these projects. Any carbon storage project needs to have a well permitted through EPA's underground injection control program. And I won't get into the details of this now for the sake of time, but this is a very intensive process that requires significant site characterization, monitoring requirements. Operators, what I want you to get from this is that operators are not going in blind. Although we're drilling holes deep in the subsurface where you can't really see things with the naked eye, the regulations require a lot of information up front to really be completely sure and be able to demonstrate that a particular site is capable of storing CO2 permanently. Next slide, please. So let's talk about a bit of history of the industry. Injection of and storage of CO2 in deep geologic formations is not a new thing. Oil and gas industry has been doing this successfully and safely since the 1970s. In fact, US oil and gas operators have injected over 1 billion tons of CO2 to date for the purpose of enhanced oil recovery. So these methods are not new. This is a well understood process. And if we want to talk about risk for a second, a geologist coming from an environmental organization, I can confidently say that the actual risk of CO2 leakage from a properly characterized geologic storage site, which again is required under regulation for these projects, is really exceedingly small. And if we want to focus a bit specifically on saline storage projects and some examples here, the Sleipner project in Norway, for example, has been storing over 1 million tons of CO2 annually for over 20 years, very safely, effectively. There's an extensive monitoring program, and we've learned a lot of lessons from that. And closer to home here, I'll also reference the Decatur project in Illinois that has stored successfully over 1 million tons of CO2 in the Mount Simon sandstone in the Illinois basin. So again, key point here is this is a mature, commercially available technology. It is safe. We have the regulatory backstop in place. And with that, please, next slide. So I just want to end on a point here on where the industry is shifting. There's a perception, I think, of the public that CCS is really trending towards focusing on enhanced oil recovery, but really the data is showing us the complete opposite. As my colleague John mentioned earlier, Clean Air Task Force tracks announced CCS projects that have been announced as a response to the 2018 amendment of the 45Q tax credit. And over 70% of these north of 90 projects announced have been pursuing saline storage. And really this boils down to one, the storage potential for saline storage is much greater and the incentives are greater. The 45Q tax credit value is higher for saline storage versus EOR. And we expect this trend to continue. So I'll just leave on one concluding remark that, as others mentioned earlier, carbon dioxide exists in the subsurface naturally. And we know that geology is capable of keeping it there permanently, as CO2 has already been trapped permanently in the subsurface for millions of years. It really all boils down to proper site characterization to make this work effectively. I'll turn it over to colleague Tom now to talk about the other end use of CO2.
Thank you, Ben. Hello, everyone. I'm Tom Dower, Vice President of Public Policy for LanzaTech. LanzaTech is a carbon capture and transformation company, and we are able to take waste carbon in many different forms and convert that to useful materials, products, chemicals, et cetera. So next slide, please. So we've heard a lot about capturing carbon, and now we've heard about sequestering carbon underground. What I'd like to talk about is taking carbon, which still has a useful life, and the fact that our economy still has quite a lot of fuels, chemicals, and products that require carbon for their very existence. And that is something that will not change. Even post 2050, 2100, humanity is using a number of products that are carbon-based. So the question really for LanzaTech is, where does that carbon come from? So with carbon utilization, I would really present it as a part of the picture. And as Simone showed in the beginning with the charts from the IPCC, there are multiple technologies that are going to help us decarbonize and really take new virgin fossil fuels out of the system. And carbon utilization is one of the technologies that we really believe is going to be absolutely necessary going forward. So essentially what we can do, and what a number of technologies are currently coming to market, can take carbon dioxide and carbon monoxide, so carbon oxides, and use those as feedstocks to produce new low carbon fuels, chemicals, and products. And these, this opportunity is really so that we can greatly reduce the amount of CO2 emissions and really get at the hard to abate sectors. There are a number of sectors that rely on carbon and energy currently in fossil fuel form, for which there are not readily available alternatives. So they are going to continue to produce goods and materials that would otherwise have CO2 emissions. And so what we have the opportunity to do is capture those emissions, some of which can be sequestered, but others can be used for utilization and essentially supplant what would otherwise come out as new fossil fuels out of the ground. Carbon utilization can also benefit communities around industrial facilities. For example, if we capture carbon that would otherwise be combusted in a secondary process at an industrial facility like a steel mill or a refinery, typically that combustion would lead to additional air pollution, not just greenhouse gases, but also particulate matter and other criteria air pollutants. And LanzaTech's example, we can take those that carbon and energy rich gas and feed it through a biological system, through a bacteria and gas fermentation, and convert those to additional products, thus avoiding some of those air pollutants. Next slide, please. So the question often comes up, how big a market is this? Well, the way we look at it is there is a huge market for the fuels and chemicals and products today, much of which will remain with us in the future, such as aviation fuel, for example, for which there are very few alternatives, and producing the materials of modern society. So by some estimates, here's just an example. Some think that there's a $70 billion market just by 2030 and $500 billion by 2040. We're seeing policymakers start to understand the utility of carbon utilization and providing policy support, which is going to be necessary as we try to really transform the economy from the incumbent fossil fuels into the sustainable future. Which means, we're seeing greater R&D funding. The Department of Energy has a number of programs, increased looking at procurement, government procurement at the state and federal levels for lower carbon products. Increasing, as has been noted before, looking at 45Q tax credits and ensuring that utilization has equal footing with carbon sequestration, so that carbon emitters have a number of choices so that they can more quickly accelerate their carbon reductions, and really recognition that there will still be carbon-based products in our economy, and the question really is, how are we going to make those products in a truly sustainable way, particularly in light of climate change? So with that, I think I'll end and turn it over to Kevin. Thank you.
Thanks, appreciate it. So my name is Kevin Patrice. I work with LIUNA, the Laborers International Union of North America. I focus on Minnesota and North Dakota, where we represent 13,000 men and women who work as construction laborers. And across the US and Canada, it's 500,000. Our members work across a variety of construction fields, everything from buildings to civil infrastructure, water, sewers, roads and bridges, and in energy and fuels, which is particularly relevant for industrial spaces, relevant for this. We are particularly excited, and I should say that our union is very involved in tackling climate efforts in Minnesota and North Dakota in particular, very involved in renewable energy, but we see carbon capture as a critical part of the toolbox for tackling climate change, and doing it by using existing skills of our members and other skilled trades who live across the upper Midwest. If we look at the next slide, please. Look at decarbonizing energy and industry. I think what's really important here is there's a lot of industry that is critically important to local economies, that produces useful products and materials. And we want to make sure that we can continue doing all of that, but do it with a lower carbon footprint. And that's challenging in many industrial sectors, either because they're energy intensive or because the chemical process, for example, cement, actually releases carbon to produce the products. And so we need these new technologies, and we need ways to capture that carbon. And renewable energy by itself doesn't get us all the way there. It's important to know about these industries, and I want to start with retention. these are above average quality jobs. So we're talking, in manufacturing sectors, in construction sectors, and industrial sectors, these jobs pay significantly more on average than other jobs, especially jobs that don't require college degrees. They're critically important to maintain. And moving toward carbon capture is about allowing these facilities to remain in business, to be compliant with forthcoming goals and requirements, whether those are requirements of government or requirements of their customers. And finally, to be more competitive in a global marketplace that demands lower carbon supply chains. And we want to not only survive in that marketplace, we want to thrive and bring industry back into the United States by being able to provide competitively a cleaner product that's produced with better paid labor. And there are critical facilities here we want to preserve, and that's the existing jobs. This is about jobs, and we go to the next slide. To have jobs, you need industry, and we need to preserve those industries. And I think that's actually the most important piece. If you look at some of the industries, and Rhodium Group's done an excellent analysis of some of the potential, you're looking at things like steel mills and refineries and cement plants that are significant sources of high quality blue collar employment, including for construction workers like the members we represent who do construction and maintenance in those facilities. And then you have new and ethanol plants. Then you have new opportunities, such as hydrogen and new infrastructure. And in the area of new infrastructure, I think it's really important to understand that jobs are about paychecks and income, but it's also really about meaning and about people's ability to contribute to their communities. And we have a lot of folks who are moving into wind and solar, but not everyone's going to be a wind and solar installer or install batteries. There's a lot of other folks with skills building pipelines, doing piping systems, pipe fitters, boiler makers, and they all want the opportunity to put their skills to work building a cleaner economy, and carbon capture is one of the technologies that we need to develop that has that opportunity. So just in pipelines, for example, we have thousands of members who build pipelines and distribution lines, build and safely maintain them, have a lot of skill and experience in this area. The creation of carbon capture pipeline networks has the opportunity to put those folks to work and those skills to work in a new industry that, instead of contributing to movement of fossil fuels, is actually capturing the carbon, reducing the carbon in the atmosphere. And they're excited to do that. And as with, the important thing for us is, as we make this transition, not only preserving existing high quality jobs, but making sure the new jobs are as good and as available to local workers as the old jobs. And that's not always as easy as it sounds, but this is an area where we believe it's possible to take those same skills, so people are earning the same paychecks, healthcare, pension benefits, except they're contributing to the solution to climate change. I'm happy to turn that over.
Thanks, Kevin. And I will round out the discussion before we move into Q&A with a short overview of the bipartisan federal investments that we have seen relative to carbon management. And so several of our speakers today have referenced the importance of the foundational 45Q tax credit policy that was reformed and expanded in 2018, and also received an extension and some modifications at the end of 2020. Coupled with the infrastructure law, which passed late last year, more than $12 billion of the infrastructure law, the bipartisan infrastructure law, is dedicated toward carbon management. And we're going to see those funds expended here in the next 5 years. So I will get into some of our pending legislative opportunities. If everything on our legislative agenda were to come together, we would see a more than 200 million metric ton reduction in annual CO2 emissions by 2035, which is really a solid and it's a good start. And it would be a very big contribution to what we need to do. Next slide. Digging in a little more deeper to the infrastructure law that passed in December, this slide and table details some of the programs that were included, including the full text of the SCALE Act, which was referenced earlier and is really focused on CO2 transport and infrastructure. It includes a loan program that is modeled after other federal loan programs for water, as an example. It also includes additional funding to ensure that the UIC program that Keith mentioned that regulates Class 6 wells, that program at EPA has additional funding and resources, not only at the federal level, but in states. In addition, we're looking at additional funding for carbon utilization, other large-scale pilot projects. And again, this infrastructure law has a 5-year time horizon. We're seeing DOE and other federal agencies that are charged with building out and implementing the infrastructure law, really getting down to brass tacks and starting to roll out programs and opportunities for state stakeholders and others to seek funding through these new programs. Next slide. So this slide details just a little bit more about the SCALE Act, and I think we can, I covered this on the last slide, Jess, so I think we can move to my last slide here in this deck. So I just wanted to highlight quickly some of our remaining priorities. All of them were included in the budget reconciliation legislation that didn't move forward at the end of last year. But, you know, implementing these priorities and getting these across the finish line would mean that we would have a healthy extension of the 45Q tax credit through 2031. Direct pay would be an option for folks to monetize the value of the tax credit at the front of a project. And we would also see increased credit values for industrial and power projects, carbon utilization, and direct air capture. So there are, you know, really, really great things in the works. We're hoping that Congress will be taking up at least a portion of what was included in previous discussions and renditions of budget reconciliation yet this spring. So with that, Ben, I think we are ready to move into Q&A.
Yes, we are. Thank you, Patrice, and all of our speakers. I guess it's fair to say we weren't kidding when we said Carbon Management 101 in describing this briefing today. Wow, that was a lot of information. Unlike school, though, there is no pop quiz. Instead, there is lots and lots of opportunity for Q&A, and we want to jump right into that. As a reminder, you can type your question in the Q&A box for me to read aloud, or you can use the raise hand feature, as Dana has done, to let me know that I should call on you. So let's start with some of the ones we have in the Q&A box. I'll try to do them in order. So Elisa Sand from the Aberdeen News in South Dakota asks, lots of residents are concerned about a proposed pipeline going through South Dakota. Most notably, people are concerned about the danger of putting the CO2 under pressure in a pipeline and what happens if there's a breach. How safe is this? And I think a couple of our folks are ready to answer this. And I believe we're going to start with John. Am I right?
Sure. Great question. And so first of all, I just go back to the, you know, it's always important to have safety. And the good news with at least CO2 pipelines is that for 50 years and, you know, 500 million metric tons of movement, we've not had any fatalities or any hospitalizations, at least in the way that the pipeline has, you know, PHMSA, the regulator, defines these things. So the track record has been really exceptional. It doesn't mean that it can't be better. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't be concerned about leaks. We all should be. But at least we have a, you know, this is as good as any kind of clean energy infrastructure, whether we're talking about transmission lines or other kinds of things. And so as we need to build on that, probably, you know, as we expand the pipeline network, look for even, you know, better ways of regulating them, inspecting them, and those kinds of things. But a couple of points. One is that, you know, there's a control room that monitors these pipelines 24/7. The developers of these pipelines are, for the most part, going beyond, you know, requirements that are set aside by PHMSA. They are X-raying every weld, not every 10th weld. And when there is a leak, you know, you can see that in the control room and they can shut it off. So it's not like there won't be accidents in the future. It won't be that we don't have to be paying attention to these kinds of things, but safety records really, really pretty outstanding.
Thank you, John. Anyone else want to chime in before I move on?
Sure, Kevin here from Lahlum. So our members build and maintain pipelines, and I would echo, I think John makes really good points. All infrastructure, obviously all infrastructure has certain risks associated with it, no different than electric lines, transmission lines that can spark fires, et cetera. And so proper construction and maintenance is really important. You want people who know what they're doing, but we have folks with decades of experience who work on these. The process is incredibly intricate for building a pipeline like this. It's very common for pipelines to have various materials under high pressures, and so they're built to withstand those pressures. They're built to, the construction techniques. And I can say that having talked to members in the field who worked for years, the construction techniques in pipelines have become just markedly better than they were 20 and 30 years ago. The engineering is much better in terms of where exactly you put the pipe to avoid any sort of geologic risk. The coating materials and the coating processes, all of it is really light years away from where it was even 30 and 40 years ago. And then you have, as John pointed out, you have detection systems. And I think the last point about this is, of all the things that you might put in a pipeline, I think CO2 is one of the lowest risks. That there are some risks, but they're pretty narrow. I think when people are concerned, you would look to the experience of the operator and the experience of the contractors and the workforce that come on there and their track record in terms of evaluating that. Obviously, there's better and worse operators out there, and so that's a fair thing to evaluate. But in terms of the technology itself, I don't think there's any question that pipelines are the safest mode of transport just across the board.
Thank you, Kevin. I'm going to move on now. Staying in the Dakotas, we do have a question from an anonymous attendee. So if you could go into the Q&A and just identify yourself so we know who to address, that would be great. And while you're doing that, we're going to go to Patrick Springer from Forum Communications in North Dakota. Could your panelists comment on North Dakota's potential for CCS? The state is making this a major priority and seeks to be a national leader. Is this realistic? Well, we have at least one person actually in North Dakota as we speak, but I'm not sure where we want to start with this one.
So this is Patrice. Hi, Pat. And I can start. And John Thompson, I'm going to turn to you to go back to your charts and talk about some of the near-term opportunities and emissions levels in North Dakota. But, I think a couple of things, Pat, to think about is, the Bakken formation, the work that's been done to understand the geology and the opportunity for storage. It does already make North Dakota a leader, and the fact that the state has positioned itself as far as a legal and regulatory framework for storage also makes this a big opportunity. So for those reasons, yes, I think absolutely North Dakota is well positioned to be a leader. There are a lot of other states across the country that are actively exploring these opportunities as well. Wyoming is another state that has primacy. Louisiana has an application in front of EPA right now. There are other states that are passing legislation or just recently have that set forth the legal and regulatory framework to see these industries flourish. I think there are more than 14 states right now that are actively considering carbon management legislation around the country. So North Dakota can definitely lead, but this industry is really on the cusp of taking off, I think, and there's broad interest around the country.
I'll just build on a few points and then maybe turn to Ben Grove to talk a little bit about maybe the geology of North Dakota. But North Dakota has a track record, right? For 20 years, there's been a 205-mile pipeline connecting the gasification project in Beulah to Saskatchewan, where that CO2 is used in EOR. And over 20 million, I think it's 20 million, let me just, actually 40 million metric tons of CO2 have moved across that pipeline 20 years without any problem. And you see a lot of, so that you have the capture experience at the gasification plant, you have the pipeline experience, and you also have a lot of projects being proposed in the ethanol field. You have other kinds of things. So I think there's at least a track record here, and maybe Ben, you want to talk a little bit about the geology in that state.
Sure, happy to briefly touch on this. Obviously, a key component of any successful carbon capture and storage project is on the storage side. North Dakota has no lack of natural geologic storage resources. There's been significant work done in the state to characterize subsurface geology. I won't get into a lot of technical specifics here, but from a geologic perspective, the state can safely store significant volumes of CO2. So that adds to being an attractive place for CCS, not beyond even just capturing and storing emissions from the state, but potentially even from other locations. So the geology is definitely a checked box there.
Thank you, Ben. I'm trying to stay in order here when the questions were asked. We're going to go to our anonymous attendee, then to Dana, who's been patiently waiting to ask the question live, and then we'll go to Jeff Beach. So our anonymous attendee is Christopher Vondracek from the Star Tribune in Minneapolis. And Christopher asks, what drove the oil and gas industry to turn to CCUS beginning in the 1970s? Was this government regulations or company sentiment?
I'm going to start, and then I'm going to have Keith Tracy, correct me if I've said anything wrong. But oil prices were very high in the 1970s because of the oil embargo, and then in the 1980s we had Congress adopting a windfall profits tax, and that was a 70% tax, at least on certain things. EOR was not among them, so you had an exemption for that. So if you captured CO2 either from natural sources or from industry, and you used it to produce oil, that oil was exempt. And that's when we saw a lot of the infrastructure come out. So that it really, that was really aimed at sort of energy security. The power it illustrates of policy to drive, this technology is pretty strong. We haven't really had that kind of strong driver ever since. And now maybe there's hope with higher levels of 45Q. So Keith, maybe you want to expand or correct something I might have said there.
Nothing correct, John. You got it great.
Thank you both very much. Let's go to Dana. Dana, you want to ask your question live. Go right ahead. Oh, thank you. There you go.
Oh, can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Great. Thank you so much for taking my question. As one of your speakers noted, in many cases, one of the intended uses of stored carbon is for enhanced oil recovery. And I'm wondering what the net impact of that is. I mean, in my mind, wouldn't that just lead to the production of more fossil fuels?
I'm happy to answer that, and maybe Ben, you will do more on this. But basically, enhanced oil recovery, just so that we're all clear on the same thing. You take CO2, you inject it underground into an aging field. It interacts with the oil that's stuck in the pores, and it helps that oil to move to the producing well. Both the CO2 and the oil come to the surface. The CO2 is separated, recompressed, and injected back down, and eventually the CO2 over multiple times is stored permanently in where the oil used to be. And so there's a bunch of different ways to look at this, but basically, it reduces the footprint of oil. Something like I think it's 60% overall, and I will double check and confirm that. But and it also varies. It depends on the formation. You can actually put more CO2 and leave it there than is found in the oil. But generally, you end up with a net benefit. You end up with definitely a net benefit. But it's not as big a benefit as that if you were to not produce oil, but inject into saline formations.
And could I just, the other point I would add, I mean, since we have members working in the Bakken and North Dakota, when CO2 is not being used to produce oil, it's fresh water that's being used, that's being injected down and used to produce oil. So it's not, CO2 isn't needed to produce oil, and that oil gets produced one way or another. It's just a question of whether we're consuming fresh water or whether we're actually using and partially storing CO2. And so I think the environmental benefits are pretty clear, and the industry doesn't need CO2 to operate.
Thank you both very much. Going to go to the next question in the Q&A box. It's from Jeff Beach in North Dakota. Isn't equating liquid CO2 with carbonated beverages misleading? It is a hazardous material. Can you explain what happened in the Mississippi pipeline rupture and the injuries there? Who wants to start with that one?
Sure, I can start there. So just to begin, what we're talking about is a breach in Mississippi near a town called Satarsha. And a lot of CO2 was released, and it was a harrowing accident. Should never have happened. It was, probably the worst CO2 accident in the past. And, that CO2 was under pressure. It also had hydrogen sulfide from, because it was produced actually in a natural dome and pulled that CO2 out. So I think that it's one of those things that PHMSA, the regulator, has yet to issue its report. And we need to learn from that experience and make sure it never happens again. But I at least take some comfort that that's probably the worst accident we've had, and we can learn from that experience. And, happily, no one died from that. So I think that, these are hazardous liquids when you transport them under pressure. It's not, that's why they're regulated the way they are. That's why you have extremely high, metal strengths. It's why, you deal with these kinds of things. But I would just go back to what we said earlier. The track record is really exceptional. Over the 50 years of moving 500 million metric tons. And I'll let my other colleagues kind of chime in on these points.
Would anyone else like to address part of that?
This is Keith. I might just add to the part because I mentioned carbonated beverages. In my experience, including 12 years of operations of CO2 capture plants and pipelines, capturing off of ethanol beginning in 2009 and fertilizer plants, the purity levels of the CO2 is very near the same as the beverage grade and food grade markets of CO2, 99+%. So that's why I did make the comparison, because the remaining portions of the CO2 that's captured from ethanol, for example, is nitrogen. And so when that's processed out, it is one and the same as a beverage grade or food grade level of CO2. And just so the record's clear, the PHMSA regulations group liquids pipelines all into one group when they regulate CO2 pipelines, ammonia pipelines, and hydrocarbon liquid lines. And technically the regulations say that all of those pipelines are hazardous pipelines, but then they add on CO2 pipelines when they were added. So under the definition under PHMSA, just to be clear, PHMSA does not consider CO2 pipelines to be transporting a hazardous material, where ammonia and the other liquids that are regulated under that set of regulations are deemed to be hazardous materials. Just wanted to clarify the record there.
Thank you, Keith, for doing that. We have 2 questions on storage, so I'm going to combine them in hopes that we can get to both of them. The first is from Nancy Garter at the Omaha World Herald. Apologies if I missed this, but are areas of the country where the geology favors safe storage and others where it doesn't? What are some of the key factors to a good geologic site? I'm going to pair that with a question from Sarah Watson from the Quad City Times in Iowa. Could the panelists elaborate on what happens to the CO2 once it is sequestered? Forgive me if this was answered already, but will the sequestered CO2 forever take up space in the sites once it's stored underground? Is it possible to fill up a site to capacity? For example, in the Decatur Mount Simon capture site closest to our readership, how long would it take for that site to fill to capacity? What would happen to pipeline infrastructure if when that would happen? So some great storage questions there. Who wants to go first?
I'm happy to take on these couple questions here. So first, I think to lay the groundwork for the question on what areas of the country are more suitable for storage versus not. Let's start by rock type. Geologic storage, we're targeting sedimentary rocks. Fortunately, in the United States, there are very vast areas across the entire country where sedimentary rocks exist. There are some key areas where your storage is not possible. There are areas along the Northeast in the United States where there just aren't storage opportunities. The geology is not appropriate. Obviously, in areas like the Rocky Mountains, there are not appropriate rocks to actually store CO2 in. Now, beyond that, I'll just get a little bit finer point. Where there are rocks that could take the CO2, another key consideration is the structure. We want to avoid areas where there are known fault zones, where there are faults, that could potentially act as leakage pathways. And so, fortunately, in the Midwest, for the most part, there are very few areas with known naturally occurring seismic activity or fault zones. It's a very stable section or column of rock throughout and very laterally expansive. So I hope that helps answer the question a bit. And now I think this is related onto the storage question of what happens when the CO2 is actually injected. This is an excellent question. The CO2 is injected. Let's use a saline aquifer for an example. The pore space that we're considering injecting into is not just an open void with nothing in it. Currently, there is brine, like a very salty water in this rock. When you inject CO2 in, it partially displaces that brine and now is in that pore space. So there's a little bit of a pressure rise that eventually fades out. We're talking very expansive containers, the geology that you're injecting into. So a couple different things can happen to the CO2 once it's injected. It can dissolve into the brine that's in the pore space, basically the CO2 literally dissolving into the brine that is now within the pore space. That's one mechanism. Another is through time, depending on the specific chemistry of the rock, that CO2 could actually mineralize, turn to a solid in the subsurface. Now, the question on can you fill up a container? This is a great question. The primary concern here is pressure. It is possible if you have wells that are clustered too close to each other, that after enough CO2 is stored, there could be pressure interference between those wells. This isn't to say that this container is completely full to its maximum capacity, but what I want to say from this is that to avoid these types of things happening, injection wells need to be intelligently designed and placed. And so part of a Class 6 well design to be able to get a permit, you have to really, an operator is actually tasked with modeling the intended injection volumes that the project intends to inject. And one of the key considerations is designing the project in a way that the pressure interfaces of each injection well don't interact. In the Illinois basin, as you've mentioned for this example, there's significant storage potential there. This really boils down to just proper planning to avoid interference. But we're talking across the United States, the potential to store is far greater than the amount of CO2 that we could ever really feasibly store. I hope that answers your question. And as Ben put in the chat, I'm always happy to have a more detailed follow-up so I don't take up too much time here.
Great. Thank you so much, Ben. And I will point out, we're not going to have time to get to Sue Retka's Shill's question for Lanzatech, which is a great question, but I'll make sure that I share it with Tom so Tom can follow up with you directly, Sue. Before we wrap up, Patrice did want to share just a couple quick resources that might be useful for continued coverage. So Patrice, over to you quickly.
Thanks, Ben. And so again, really appreciate everyone taking the time to join us today. We hope that this is the beginning of a discussion with all of you. And so please do reach out to Ben if you would like to arrange for follow-up discussions or you have questions that you'd still like answered. In addition, I'd like to just point everybody to a couple of resources that we do have available. So we have state level fact sheets, analytical resources, and other materials at carboncaptureready.org. For the question on storage and those kinds of things, actually GPI just released a carbon and hydrogen hubs atlas, and there's a great map in that atlas at carboncaptureready.org that showcases some of the known geologic storage areas around the country. In addition, the Carbon Capture Coalition website, which includes information about legislative priorities, also the coalition's federal policy blueprint, that's available at carboncapturecoalition.org.
Patrice, thank you so much. You can see some of those graphics there on the screen as we wrap up today. We did ask for an hour of your time, and we do want to try to keep to that. So thank you all very much for joining us for this introductory conversation about carbon management. We hope this discussion will be helpful to your ongoing reporting. If you do have additional questions, as Patrice mentioned, as I put in the chat, you can send them to me at ben@renewpr.com, and I will follow up with you. Please join me in thanking our guest speakers, Patrice Lahlum, Dr. Simone Stewart, John Thompson, Keith Tracy, Ben Grove, Tom Dower, and Kevin Pranis. And thank you again for joining us today. Be well, be safe, and take care.